Hi, it's me, Roosevelt. So, Arlecchino's story quest delves into her past and the history of the House of the Hearth. And, we also got some Khaenri'ah lore. Primarily that Arlecchino is Khaenri'ahn, which feels super weird to say because she's a bit different from the Khaenri'ahns we've met already. Piero immediately recognized that she was a descendant of the Crimson Moon Dynasty, but was surprised that any were still left. And when she asks him for more info, he literally tells her to go read a book. Who would have thought that the jester was this funny? The book in question is Leobranto Innamorato, but you might probably recognize it as Perinheri. If you haven't read it, you should, or you should at least check out my previous video. That video also provides a lot of context for the content of this one. The key thing to know, however, is that Khaenri'ah had two dynasties, the earlier Crimson Moon, from which Arlecchino descended from, and the later Eclipse, which is known for its biggest hit, which is the Cataclysm of 500 years ago. The only real distinction Perinheri makes between the two is that the Crimson Moon valued alchemy, while the Eclipse valued machinery. The Crimson Moon was also later known as the Balemoon, and this Balemoon legacy is carried by Arlecchino. So I first want to use new information alongside Perinheri to reconstruct more of the history of the dynasties, and then we'll definitely circle back to Arlecchino because I think her whole shtick actually tells us a lot about the nature of the Crimson Moon. To summarize what we know now, a noble clan ruled the Underground Kingdom in ancient times before the Dark Sun illuminated the Underground. This Dark Sun, of course, refers to the Eclipse Dynasty. The priest convinced the muddle-minded king that the Crimson Moon ruled over all, for it was the same color as the blood of people and the abyss. And so the king took the moon's name, and by the light and flame of the two worlds, he ruled and judged fickle fate. So they prayed to the Crimson Moon for salvation, and they yearned for transcendent individuals to build glorious towers. To this end, they constructed an orphanage to take in shipwrecked sailors from the Starry Sea who might have the ability to transcend the gods. But it seems like they never succeeded on that front. This continued until the astrologist glimpsed in the inverted image of the false sky the origin of all the world's fate. This seemingly caused doubt and anger across the kingdom, leading to destruction. The followers of the Crimson Moon Dynasty all but disappeared, with the few remaining lurking in the shadows and yearning for vengeance. But the so-called repayment never came, and the Dark Sun fell to the same ignorance and arrogance. This end would be the Cataclysm of 500 years ago. So that's the general story. I think the big picture takeaway is that the Crimson Moon Dynasty is nothing like the Khaenri'ah we've heard about. Khaenri'ah was supposedly a godless nation and the pride of humanity. But in contrast, the Crimson Moon Dynasty held some sort of reverence for the Crimson Moon. They prayed to the moon and even had a ritual dedicated to it. It may not have been a god, but it was certainly some sort of important or spiritual or even a holy icon. The difference in the dynasties is also emphasized with the fall of the Crimson Moon Dynasty. Clearly, something happened that created bad blood between the two. There was also clearly a shift in the ruling bloodlines as there were few survivors. This is why Piero himself was so surprised by Arlecchino's existence. The boss description for the Knave seems to also suggest that the people of the Crimson Moon Dynasty drank poison before the eclipse. This could have been a literal execution, or even their own attempt to escape the new dynasty's reign. Or it could have been metaphorical, which opens up a whole new can of speculation worms. But regardless, the followers of the Crimson Moon Dynasty did hold resentment, and the pursuit of vengeance is reflected in the self-proclaimed prophet's words to Dainsleif about the Crimson Moon swallowing the eclipse. Now, this next section is going to be a lot of speculation, but to me, it seems that the uncovering of certain truths was at the crux of the Crimson Moon Dynasty's collapse. The description for the Crimson Moon semblance says, "The astrologists branded as heretics glimpsed in the inverted image of the false sky the origin of all the world's fate." Now, this is a bit perplexing given that Khaenri'ah was underground and perhaps entirely separate from Teyvat, and thus wouldn't be under the same fake sky. But let's just run with the fact that they did have astrologists and they discovered the truth of the fake sky. Or maybe rather, the boundaries of the world created to protect it. There are quite a few directions we can go with this, but let's hone in on the fact that the astrologists were branded as heretics. This would imply that whatever astrology they were doing was prohibited, and maybe in a sense, the knowledge they obtained was perhaps, forbidden. So perhaps the Eclipse Dynasty was marked by spying upon the secrets beyond the sky. There's another critical piece of information that I think supports this. As I mentioned earlier, in Perinheri, the main and really only distinction that's made between the two dynasties was the methodology for the creation of weaponry to protect themselves from outside threats. This difference in methodology is that the Crimson Moon valued alchemy, while the Eclipse valued machinery. In my video on Perinheri, I explored the idea that this switch in methodology at its core is due to a switch in power source. According to Vahumana scholars, early Khaenri'ahn technology relied solely on condensed leyline energy, or azosite, as a power source. But later it switched to a perpetual and dark power. In fact, all Ruin machines have a dark power source. It's only the early ones that have a backup source based on leyline energy. It's safe to assume that this dark power source is, or is at least related to, abyssal power or forbidden knowledge, and peeking beyond the skies. We can take this further with some more speculation. This power from beyond the skies allowed Khaenri'ah to throw off the shackles imposed by the world's law. At this point, we can presume that the secret of the fake sky has to do with the world's law. That is, the heavenly principles, and specifically fate as a mechanism of control. Consider Nouvelette's 5th character story, for example. There, it says that fate is merely the manner in which the present ruler of this world plays with living beings, and also compares divine rules to puppet strings. This is all in context to him not needing a constellation. So, perhaps the Eclipse Dynasty wanted to reject this idea of fate and control, thus fully becoming a truly godless nation and the pride of humanity. This implies, though, that the Crimson Moon Dynasty submitted to this control, and the Crimson Moon itself may have something to do with fate. The descriptions surrounding it certainly never fail to bring it up. Just one example is the Knave's earring, which says that fate casts an examining eye on humanity. Which of course is sus because in Perinheri the Crimson Moon is a giant eyeball. And aside from the semblance's reference to the Balemoon sealing doom, the Crimson Moon has also seemingly played a role in sealing fate, because it seems to have at least been present during the destruction and punishment of Gurabad, Remuria, and ultimately Khaenri'ah. And I do think it's rather suspicious that the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles also has motifs of glitching and red eyes all over the cubes. I'm loath to come to any further conclusions on this just yet, but I do explore this idea in my Perinheri video, as well as how the moon is tied not only to fate, but also judgment and retribution. So for now, I'll leave my musings on this as food for thought. But I want to shift my focus back to Arlecchino, and in particular, a recurring phrase that we see in a lot of places now, the flame of two worlds. All we really know about Arlecchino's origins is that she's a descendant of the Crimson Moon Dynasty, but notably, her ancestry gives her certain powers. The ancient Balemoon Blood fire burns within Arlecchino, the noble blood serving as both curse and blessing. Arlecchino also sees the Crimson Moon in her dreams, which is an obvious reference to Perinheri. In Perinheri, there's a ritual where children pass through darkness and they hallucinate seeing a crimson moon, which may turn around to reveal a giant horrified eye. When they emerge, they are told that they survived the Fire of Two Worlds. This Fire of Two Worlds has been coming up a lot. I mean, the patch name even references it And even the Crimson Moon semblance is described as being used as a ritual to bridge two worlds. And Arlecchino herself is titled the Cinder of Two Worlds in her second boss form. In thinking about what the two worlds are, I realize there could be a lot of possibilities, but I think the answer is actually simple. It's life and death. The Vibrant Pinion also mentions two worlds, and we can infer it's talking about life and death there, because the Divine Bird was charged with protecting the border between death and new birth. But note the particular wording about death and new birth and not life and death, because I think it's getting at the issue that things are not as clear-cut as transient life versus permanent afterlife. Consider this. Arlecchino's story quest strongly emphasizes that Arlecchino equates the loss of memory to dying. She truly believes that she is executing her children by erasing their memories. And I think that her belief is getting at something deeper with the relationship between life and memory. Because this is a concept we've heard before from the Aranara. Aranaga explicitly told us, death is just a one-time loss of memory. We witness many Aranara die and become reborn as they completely forget about us and our shared experiences. Now, despite the Aranara being different because they are spirits and they're self-aware that they lose memories, you could argue that this is not unlike what happened with the children of the House of the Hearth that Arlecchino executed. They're living their new lives, but they have no past memories. The memories that made them who they used to be. But we've seen an instance where this connection between life and memory is taken very, very literally. At the end of Nahida's second story quest, the elemental beings sacrifice themselves to revitalize the heart of Oasis. And to do this, their memories are reverted to pure elemental energy. So this was a bit of a winding path, but I just wanted to explore this idea of memory in the context of life, death, and rebirth, and particularly in the context of the two worlds. Consider this. During his trial, Perinheri was asked if he was dead, and he answers yes. When he emerges, he is told, you have traversed the fire of two worlds within the hearth, and here you are reborn. And consider this small little detail mentioned. All of this was Perinheri's very first memory. So again, this is all just speculation. And I'm going to further explore this thing about memory and Arlecchino in a little bit. But I first wanted to get something off my mind that's been bugging me, and that's Caterpillar. Pun intended. Due to the fact that Arlecchino's arm reveal and Caterpillar were dropped in the same patch, there have been a lot of ideas, including my own, about Arlecchino's connection to Narcissus, or being a hilichurl, or whatever. I'm personally now thinking that this ritual of the two worlds is the thematic connection between Caterpillar and Arlecchino. Let's recall Caterpillar's origins. The remains of Carter, and probably other people, were used to create him. Narcissus used the Holy Blade with the remains, as well as a hilichurl, to grant this new being consciousness and intellect. This birth was Caterpillar's first memory. And, in a sense, what was dead was given new life, but at the cost of a complete loss of identity and memory. So what I'm basically trying to say is that I think Caterpillar was reborn in the same way that Perinheri was, through a ritual, both of which, in my opinion, could be alchemical in nature. Not to sound like a broken record, but I explored this already in my Perinheri video. But my main justification for this is that Narcissus studied Khaenri'ahn technology and alchemy was the bread and butter of the Crimson Moon Dynasty. And Narcissus did have a similar motivation. Renee wanted to become a descender, or a transcendent one, so why not look to an ancient ritual that was trying to catch or create descenders or transcendent ones themselves? And, maybe, the Crimson Moon semblance, which was used in the Crimson Moon ritual, served the same function as the Holy Blade of Narcissus. So, this connection between Caterpillar and Perinheri has a lot of interesting implications for Arlecchino. The Crimson Moon Dynasty never found a transcendent one, and neither did Narcissus succeed in his efforts to become a descender. But if this is the truth behind Arlecchino's origins, then what about her? I personally think it's a bit more complicated with Arlecchino, because as I mentioned, the ancient Balemoon Bloodfire burns within her, and it's this noble bloodline which gives her her immense power. So let's talk about her unique attributes and abilities, because I think this goes back to this discussion about death and memory. Arlecchino's curse can flare up, and it's implied to be linked to emotion. In the animation, we see a flare-up during her spider's funeral, and repressed when she's around Clervie, her bestie. And it certainly appears during the heated battle with Crucibina. As such, it's implied that repressing emotion can keep it under control. This may explain her vigilance in controlling her emotion. Anger leads to impulsivity, and sorrow lets you waver. And similarly, this is why Neuvillette can't get a read on her. She's like still water with no ripples. This serves an important purpose for Arlecchino. She feels that if it reaches her heart, it will make her change. Furthermore, it seems as though this curse is killing her anyway. Arlecchino is already looking to Lyney as a successor, perhaps predicting a protracted lifespan. The Knave boss description also says that the Hearthfire's radiance will incinerate the last descendant of the Blood Moon, Arlecchino. Also, Dainsleif says that her fiery blood corrodes her flesh. Now, as for what this curse gifts her with. She has fire coursing through her veins, and apparently it can be bottled up and used to erase people's individual memories. At the end of the quest, this is used to kill the traitors to the House of the Hearth. Because remember, Arlecchino sees the loss of memory as death. It was part of a plan she proposed to Neuvillette long in advance. She also mentioned that this bottled flame was part of a secret experiment. Earlier in the quest, we learned that Arlecchino had declined any collaboration with the Torre regarding the members of the House of the Hearth, but she did agree to one experiment. This bottling of her Balemoon fireblood was likely this sole experiment. This gets really interesting when you remember that Signora similarly used fire to burn away her painful memories, and the Witch's Heartflame artifact actually contains liquid fire. It even says the techniques involved in making liquid fire have since been lost, implying that bottling liquid fire used to be a thing. So perhaps Dottore is making it a thing again. This is foreshadowing for the end of the video. But Arlecchino's main ability is also probably the most revealing. Arlecchino's fire leaves after images or shadows of anything it consumes. At times, they were fragments of memory, and at others, they donned the aspect of dazzling colors. Clervie is an exceptional example of this illusion born of flame. Her shadow was so robust due to the sheer strength of will Clervie had during her life, with her kindness and her resolve for freedom so great she chose to die. So, the power of the Balemoon Bloodfire revolves around this concept of memory, primarily destroying it or freezing it, I'd say. It makes sense then why Perinheri would have seen the Crimson Moon during his rebirth trial, during death and loss of memory and eventual rebirth. But I don't know if it makes sense with the other imagery we've seen associated with the Crimson Moon, that is, its connection to fate. But here's another perspective to consider. Arlecchino's ability to create shadows or after images reminds me of the Sin Shades in Enkanomiya, which are explicitly called after images by Antigonus. Enjo explains that due to Enkanomiya's properties as a netherrealm, Enkanomiya sometimes projects shadows of the past based on remnant thoughts. Powerful emotions are captured and frozen. And interestingly, a loading screen tip says that when Istaroth looks upon someone with favor, their feelings and memories will be preserved in the world. A connection with Istaroth here would be very intriguing, given my previous suggestion that the Crimson Moon is linked to the heavenly principles and fate. And also because of a lot of imagery associated with Raiden A and the Crimson Moon, and the omnipresent god statue. But I'm getting way ahead of myself, and that's not quite the direction I want to hone in on. The essential part I want to highlight is that the sin shades are described as unique leyline phenomena. The underlying cause behind them are leyline anomalies. Leylines are the conduit through which memories flow to Irminsul, which is the ultimate repository of all memory in Teyvat. So to me, it would make more sense for Arlecchino's abilities to be more related to leylines and Irminsul. I mean, just consider how Enjo talks about them. Though their stories have already ended, who they were at the moment is captured and retained. They can even interact with you. I mean, that sounds like Clairvy to me, aside from the loss of 10 years. I guess this is all just to say, this could go in quite a few different directions. Just as a heads up, I'm not sure if I'm actually going to be able to resolve all these threads that I've unraveled. So let's get a little creative here. Come play with me in this space. Consider this the high-octane crack-theorizing warning. So I was racking my brain about what exactly could be special about this noble bloodline. So I was thinking about what else do we know about the nobility? What do we know about the king? And I was struck by this one line in the Crimson Moon semblance. This being so, the king of humanity should take upon himself the name of the Crimson Moon. If we conflate nobility with royalty just a little bit, and also consider the memory-based powers of Arlecchino's bloodline, I think this line would make more sense if the king had taken the name of Irminsul. And I know that may come across as a very out-of-left-field, sort of nothing-burger, non-sequitur what-if, but I only mention it because it would answer a very long-standing question about the name of the king of Khaenri'ah, King Irmin. And side note, yes, I know in the original Chinese, Irminsul isn't called that, it's called like World Tree or Ancient Tree or Silver Tree, but they're still going for an Odin Yggdrasil theme, and Yggdrasil was named for Odin, so let's just run with that. So I want to talk about King Irmin for a little bit, as usual, as I always do. In my Perinheri video, I kinda joked about how the one-eyed King Irmin was literally a giant red eyeball moon. As funny as that would be, I want to more seriously explore some of the connections I'm seeing between King Irmin and the Crimson Moon. First off, even before we knew anything about the Crimson Moon Dynasty, a lot of us had wondered, was Khaenri'ah truly a godless nation? This originally emerged from a few observations, like Irmin's potential Odin inspirations, but also because of the statuettes, which many think represent Irmin because they have one eye, and they're held by Khaenri'ahns. The gloomy statuette description says it must have been cherished like some holy icon. The Eclipse Dynasty certainly weren't fans of piety, but the Crimson Moon Dynasty, on the other hand, prayed to the moon. And then there's the Deathly statuette. It's black and red with a glowing ruby eye, and a double helix pattern in his horns. I can't help but look at this now, and also at Arlecchino's boss design, and draw visual comparisons. For example, with Arlecchino's double helix spikes, and the single ruby eye in her hair. In my Perinheri video, I made the argument that the Crimson Moon is basically the Auge de Vertalang, or the Eye of Condemnation. Basically, it's this ruby red eye that can see all fate and all truth of the world. There's a lot of explanation that went into this, but basically it boils down to the fact that Odin had the gift of Satyr, which is the gift of foresight and prophecy, seeing fate. And now I also wonder about the implications of Irmin being the king who took on the name of the Crimson Moon, because in the description, the king is muddle-minded. The ruler in Perinheri was similarly muddle-minded as he didn't understand his advisor's idea to create an orphanage for transcendent ones. I mainly wanted to note that simply because it's a weird detail to mention twice in two different places. And I think it would be ironic that the king named for a memory tree himself potentially has some cognitive impairments and even memory issues. But at the same time, I'm inclined to believe that King Irmin was more than just a confused dude sitting on the throne. So perhaps this muddle-mindedness and perhaps memory loss is alluding to a more complicated story. But this is all just to say that I think King Irmin has a lot to do with the Crimson Moon. And now I think there is some sort of tie between the Crimson Moon and Irminsul, although I can't quite verbalize what exactly that is. Vibes only right now. But consider this as well. Irminsul is also linked to fate. Nihida explicitly says that the prophecy of Fontaine was etched into Irminsul. This would imply that Irminsul contains more than just all the memory of Teyvat. It's literally also recording the history of the future. So it makes me wonder if the Crimson Moon and Irminsul are just two parts of the same system, two parts with very different functions. If the Crimson Moon is a watchful eye of fate, then Irminsul would be the brain. Now, this was just supposed to be an analogy, but I'm realizing there could be more to that as well. Like, consider what Venti said in the webcomic about the creation of other worlds. Panku's blood became rivers and seas, and Purusha's body became all living things, and Ymir's brain became the clouds. These are all creation deities who used their bodies to create the world. And I've wondered before if the Primordial One did the same thing with the creation of Teyvat. I mean, according to Before Sun and Moon, the Primordial One did use the eggshell from which it was born to separate the universe from the microcosm of the world. So yes, this would suggest that all this beautiful scenery is just the corpse of a primordial dead god. Okay, so that was a bit of a tangent, a crack theory within a crack theory, but just one last thing about Irmin. I'd be remiss not to mention Legend of the Shattered Halberd. In Shattered Halberd, the first divine halberd Irmin pierced the Axis Mundi and connected the 9 worlds. I've previously wondered if this was a reference to connecting the light and dark and human realms, or peeking beyond the skies. But now I also wonder if it's a reference to bridging the 2 worlds. That's really all I have to say about that. I mean, I've come up with like 50 different interpretations of that line alone, so like, statistically one of them has to be right? I don't know math. But that's all of my crack theorizing, tinfoil, speculative brain rot about Irmin for now. I actually meant to keep talking about Arlecchino, and then I blacked out, and now I'm in a cell with pictures of red moons and deathly statuettes and silver trees everywhere. That's weird. So going way back to the liquid fire that erases memory, it'd be super interesting to know why Dottore might be interested in that. Because do you remember that dream Kole had in Winter Night's Lazo, where Dottore is burning a tree? Since it never happened in Sumeru, a lot of us, including myself, kind of thought that it was simply a dream, or metaphorical of the threats he poses. But now I wonder. A consistent theme of the Fatui is burning the old world away. Piero says that will be Signora's final resting place, and the boss description for the Knave says, "Someday, the Hearthfire's faint radiance shall burn the old world away." And on top of that, Arlecchino also says that losing a substantial amount of memory would be like living in the past, like returning to a version of yourself that never grew up. So, what better way to burn an imaginary memory tree than with a liquid fire that specifically erases memories? And remember, to destroy memory is to die, and ultimately be reborn. So ultimately, I think this is a big part of the Fatui's plan to rebel against the heavenly principles. And also, I think it's kind of guaranteed to happen. In that same voice line where Nouvelette talks about the divine rules being like puppet strings, it says those puppet strings glossed as divine rules would one day be burned away by the fires of judgment. And finally, one last thing I wonder about. Both Wanderer and Child have voice lines that describe the Knave as being completely crazy, which we didn't really see though because she's actually very polite and very conversational and also pretty rational. I mean, aside from the fact that she's raising a literal serial killer. And you could say that perhaps they're talking about the old Knave, and with Child, maybe it was the rooster just spreading misinformation. But I wonder a lot about that one character story that talks about Arlecchino's curse reaching her heart and inducing a change. So I wonder, as we get closer to the climax of the Fatui's plans, if we might have the chance to see that change, if something will happen. Now, is this just me wanting to see Arlecchino go sicko mode? Perhaps. But at the same time, Arlecchino did say that during this plan with the winter and night of Project Stuja, that the blood moon would rise. So I'm very interested to see what happens there. Thank you all for watching. I really appreciate you guys tolerating me as I just kind of think out loud and scream at the sky. But as I said, this is all speculation, and a lot of this can go in a lot of different directions, and I might post this video and immediately change my mind about everything, so... Listen, maybe the real lore here is the friends we made along the way. Oh, also, I just realized I didn't mention Kaya, but I do want to say I stand by my Kaya theory from my last video. I still think that's a possibility. I mean, it is really cool to think about the parallels between Kaya and Arlecchino, so it'd be even cooler if they met and actually talked about, like, lore in Khaenri'ah. Anyway, so please like, comment, and subscribe. Share your own theories in the comments. And have you checked your smoke detector batteries recently? I know I have, because they're currently going off because I cooked too hard with this theory and my kitchen is currently on fire. I better go take care of that. Okay, bye!